Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Today we talk about the mercies of the Prophet Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, a mercy that still lights our way today, a mercy that forgave even its enemies.
The mercy of the Prophet, a timeless message for today. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Allahumma salli wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. In a world that often feels fractured by anger, revenge and indifference, there is a story that has been told for over 14 centuries and yet continues to offer something the modern heart desperately needs. The story of a man whose life was defined not by power or conquest, but by mercy. When the Quran describes the Prophet Muhammad, it does not primarily call him a warrior, a statesman, or even a lawgiver, though he was all of these in some measure. It calls him a mercy to all the worlds, not a mercy to one nation, one tribe, one religion, or one era, but to all the worlds, to every creature that walks, crawls, or breathes. This single description carries within it an entire philosophy of life, one that feels almost startlingly relevant to a world in the year 2026. A world weary of division, cruelty, and the endless news cycle of conflict. To understand why this matters today, it helps to remember the world into which this mercy was first revealed. 7th century Arabia was not a gentle place. It was a land where baby girls were sometimes buried alive because they were considered a burden, where tribal feuds could last generations over a single insult, where the strong preyed upon the weak without much thought, and where slavery, poverty, and violence were simply accepted as the natural order of things. Into this harsh landscape stepped a man who, rather than meeting cruelty with cruelty, chose again and again to meet it with compassion. This choice was not born of weakness. He was, by every account, capable of decisive and even fierce leadership when circumstances demanded it. But time after time, when he had every justification and every opportunity to punish, humiliate, or destroy those who had wronged him, he chose forgiveness instead. That pattern, repeated so consistently across the different chapters of his life, is what makes his mercy worth studying rather than simply admiring from a distance. Consider the city of Ta'if. Early in his mission, when the Prophet had lost the protection of his uncle and was searching for anyone willing to listen to his message, he traveled on foot to this nearby town, hoping to find support. Instead, the people of Ta'if mocked him, rejected his message, and incited their children and servants to pelt him with stones until his feet bled and his sandals were soaked in blood. He walked away from that town bruised, humiliated, and utterly alone, save for his companion who tried in vain to shield him from the stones. Tradition tells us that in that moment of raw, physical, and emotional pain, an angel appeared and offered to crush the two mountains surrounding Ta'if between them, wiping out everyone who had hurt him if he simply gave the word. It would have been, by any human standard, a justified request. He had done nothing but offer guidance, and he had been answered with blood and cruelty. Yet his response was not a command for destruction. He asked instead that these very people, or if not them, then their children, might one day come to worship God alone. There is something almost unbearably moving about this moment. A man in physical agony, choosing hope for his tormentors' descendants over vengeance against his tormentors themselves. This is not the mercy of someone who has nothing to lose. This is the mercy of someone who understands that hatred, once released, only multiplies itself, while mercy has the power to interrupt that cycle entirely. Perhaps the most famous demonstration of this mercy came years later, at what should have been the moment of ultimate reckoning. After enduring exile, assassination attempts, boycotts, and years of open warfare initiated by the very people of Mecca who had once driven him from his home. The Prophet returned to that city not as a refugee, but at the head of an army large enough to conquer it without resistance. Every instinct of ancient warfare, every precedent set by the empires and tribes around them, suggested that this was the moment for retribution. The Meccans themselves seemed to expect it. Many braced for slaughter, remembering their own treatment of him and his followers. Instead, standing before the very people who had tortured his companions, killed his loved ones, and driven him into exile, he asked them a simple question: "What do you expect me to do with you now?" When they replied, hoping perhaps against hope, that they expected only goodness from a noble brother and the son of a noble brother, he answered with words that have echoed through history ever since: "Go, for you are free. No mass executions, no enslavement, no plunder." A conquering army that, by the standards of virtually every empire before or since, chose restraint over retribution on the very day it held absolute power. It is difficult to overstate how radical this was, and it remains a challenge to any of us today who imagine that strength must always be expressed through domination rather than restraint. But the mercy of the Prophet was never reserved only for the grand historic moments. It lived in the smallest details of his daily life, and this perhaps is where his example becomes most instructive for ordinary people trying to live decent lives today. He was known to interrupt his own prayers if he heard a child crying, shortening his recitation out of concern for the mother's distress. He would carry his young granddaughter on his shoulders even while leading prayers in the mosque, setting her down gently when he needed to bow and picking her back up when he stood. He mended his own clothes, milked his own goats, and helped with household chores, refusing the kind of self-important detachment that so often accompanies those in positions of authority and reverence. When an elderly, blind and impoverished Jewish woman who lived near the outskirts of Medina used to speak ill of him to visitors, unaware of who was actually bringing her food and gently cleaning her home each day, it was the Prophet himself performing this service anonymously. Only after his death did she learn from those who continued the task in his absence, whose hands had been serving her all along. That she wept upon learning the truth is perhaps the most fitting testimony to what genuine, unadvertised compassion looks like. In an age of curated kindness, where good deeds are so often performed for an audience or a photograph, this quiet, anonymous mercy stands as a rebuke to the performative virtue that surrounds us now. His mercy extended remarkably for his time, even to animals. He spoke of a woman condemned for having locked up a cat until it died of hunger, neither feeding it nor releasing it to find food for itself, and conversely praised a sinner who was forgiven simply for giving water to a thirsty dog in the desert. He instructed his followers to sharpen their blades and show ease to the animal being slaughtered for food, minimizing its suffering even in that difficult moment. He forbade the practice of branding animals on the face and spoke against overburdening pack animals with more than they could bear. At a time when animals were treated as mere property, without feeling or worth beyond their utility, this is a striking ethical position, one that modern conversations about animal welfare and environmental responsibility are in many ways still catching up to. His compassion toward children too deserves particular attention, especially in a modern world grappling with questions of child welfare, discipline, and family dynamics. He was famously affectionate with children, kissing them, playing with them, and gently correcting them without harshness. When a Bedouin man expressed surprise that the Prophet kissed his grandchildren, remarking that he had 10 children and had never kissed a single one, the Prophet's reply was simple and pointed. What can I do for you if God has removed mercy from your heart? This exchange captures something essential about his worldview. Mercy was not, in his understanding, a soft or optional virtue reserved for the sentimental. It was the very measure of a person's relationship with the divine and with the rest of creation. To lack mercy was not simply a personality trait. It was, in his eyes, a spiritual deficiency. What makes all of this relevant today, rather than simply a pleasant historical anecdote, is the sheer scale of cruelty and division that continues to define so much of modern life. We live in a period marked by polarized politics, where opposing viewpoints are met not with dialogue, but with contempt. We live with a refugee crisis that has displaced tens of millions of people, many of whom are met with suspicion and hostility rather than the hospitality that was so central to the Prophet's own example, given that he himself was once a refugee fleeing persecution. We live in a digital age where cruelty can be delivered instantly and anonymously through a screen, where a moment's anger can be broadcast to millions before reflection has a chance to intervene. Against this backdrop, the model of mercy embodied by the Prophet offers something that feels almost countercultural. The radical notion that strength and gentleness are not opposites. That power is most impressive not when it is exercised to its fullest extent, but when it is restrained out of compassion. There is also a particular relevance to how this mercy extended across lines of religion and tribe. Something desperately needed in a world still scarred by sectarian conflict and religious intolerance. The Prophet drew up agreements with the Jewish and other communities of Medina that guaranteed their religious freedom and protection under a shared civic framework. One of the earliest known examples of a pluralistic city-state built on mutual rights and responsibilities rather than the domination of one group over another. He instructed his followers that whoever wrongs a person under such protection or burdens them beyond their capacity or takes anything from them without their consent, he himself would be their advocate on the day of judgment. This is not the language of tolerance as mere coexistence, gritting one's teeth and putting up with those who are different. It is the language of active protection and advocacy for the rights of people outside one's own community, a standard that many modern societies, for all their professed commitment to pluralism, still struggle to fully embody. Perhaps most powerfully, his mercy was not conditional on how he himself had been treated. This is the detail that separates genuine mercy from mere strategic tolerance. It would be easy to be kind to those who have been kind to you. There is little virtue required in that. The test of mercy is how one behaves toward those who have caused genuine harm. And it is precisely here that his example shines brightest. The uncle of one of his closest companions, a man named Wahshi, had killed the Prophet's own beloved uncle in battle, mutilating his body afterward in a way calculated to cause maximum grief. Yet when Wahshi later embraced the same faith and came to seek forgiveness, fearful and ashamed, he was accepted without malice. Though the Prophet did ask, in a moment of very human and understandable grief, that Wahshi keep himself out of his direct sight. So painful was the memory. Even here, in a moment of restrained personal pain, there was no retaliation, no demand for retribution, only the space for a person to change and be received into a new life. None of this is to suggest that mercy, as exemplified in this life, meant an absence of justice or a passive tolerance of wrongdoing. He established laws, held people accountable, and did not shy away from difficult decisions when the well-being of the community demanded it. But mercy consistently softened the application of justice, especially where personal grievance was concerned. He distinguished sharply between the rights of God, which called for firm boundaries, protecting the community as a whole, and his own personal rights, which he almost always chose to forego in favor of forgiveness. This distinction matters enormously for anyone today trying to figure out how to hold firm principles while also extending grace to the people who fall short of them, whether in politics, in family life, or in the countless small conflicts that make up ordinary human relationships. There is another dimension to this mercy that rarely receives the attention it deserves. And that is the mercy he showed toward those who were simply struggling, imperfect, or slow to understand. A young companion once confessed to him that he could not stop himself from looking at women in ways he knew were wrong, expecting harsh rebuke for such an admission. Instead of condemnation, the Prophet asked him gently whether he would want such a thing done to his own mother, sister, or daughter, guiding him toward empathy rather than shame. And the young man reported that afterward he found the temptation had lost its grip on him entirely. This was not mercy as the absence of correction, but mercy as the wisest and gentlest form of correction, one that reached the heart rather than merely punishing the behavior. In an age where public shaming has become almost a national pastime, where a single mistake can define a person forever in the eyes of strangers online, this approach to human failing feels like a lost art worth recovering. People were treated as capable of growth, not permanently defined by their worst moment. This same spirit extended to how he handled anger directed at himself personally. A Bedouin man once grabbed him roughly by his cloak, pulling it so hard that it left a mark on his neck, and demanded provisions in a rude and entitled manner without so much as a greeting. Those around him were furious and moved to punish the man for his disrespect. The Prophet, however, simply laughed, ordered that the man be given what he asked for, and moved on without a trace of resentment. It would have taken so little to interpret that moment as an affront demanding response, and yet he chose to see past the insult to the man's need and his ignorance rather than his rudeness. This capacity to absorb personal insult without allowing it to curdle into bitterness is perhaps one of the hardest aspects of his character to emulate, precisely because it asks us to separate our ego from our sense of justice, something modern culture, with its emphasis on being seen to stand up for oneself at every turn, makes especially difficult. His mercy also showed itself in his treatment of the enslaved and the socially marginalized, groups who in 7th century Arabia had essentially no voice or protection of their own. He consistently urged his followers to feed enslaved people the same food they themselves ate, clothe them the same way they clothed themselves, and never burden them with work beyond their capacity, and if such work was assigned, to help with it personally rather than simply commanding from a distance. He freed enslaved people himself on numerous occasions and praised freeing another human being as one of the most virtuous acts a person could perform. He elevated formerly enslaved individuals, such as his own freed servant and adopted companion, to positions of genuine respect and leadership within the community, in direct defiance of the rigid social hierarchies of his time. None of this dismantled the institution of slavery overnight, a fact honest history must acknowledge, but the trajectory his teachings set in motion, treating enslaved people as full human beings deserving of dignity, provisions, and eventual freedom, planted seeds whose implications continued to unfold for generations after him. Even in matters of household life, where cruelty and neglect were so often hidden from public view and consequence in his time, his example offered a strikingly different model. He was known to help with sewing, cleaning, and cooking within his own home, treating this domestic labor not as beneath him, but as an ordinary part of shared life. When asked about the best among believers, he pointed to good character, and specifically to how a man treats his own family and household, insisting that the truest test of a person's faith was not visible in public displays of piety, but in the quiet, unwitnessed kindness shown behind closed doors. This is a standard that remains searingly relevant, given how frequently public virtue and private cruelty coexist in the same individuals even now. A person's real character, he seemed to insist again and again, is revealed not in how they behave when being watched, but in how they treat those who have the least power to hold them accountable. A child, a spouse, an employee, an animal, a stranger who will never repay the kindness. In the end, the enduring power of this story is not that it describes a perfect distant figure whose example is impossible to follow. It is that it describes, in painstaking and very human detail, someone who was tested again and again with exactly the kinds of provocations that tempt all of us toward anger, revenge, and cruelty, and who chose deliberately and repeatedly a different path. That path did not require him to be weak, naive, or without boundaries. It required only that he remember, even in his most painful and vulnerable moments, that mercy given freely tends to return multiplied, while cruelty given freely only breeds more of the same. For a world still learning this lesson the hard way, through wars that never seem to end and divisions that never seem to heal, the example of a mercy extended to all the worlds remains not simply a matter of religious devotion, but a genuinely practical blueprint for how human beings might yet learn to treat one another with the dignity every person, believer and non-believer alike, ultimately deserve.